and welcome to one of our online lectures here in History Through Film. Today we're going to continue on with our unit on Eastern civilizations, focusing on a second piece of Japanese history. The first piece we really looked at was really the samurai, and we watched the film The Last Samurai to really look at that and understand it. But what we want to do is we want to progress and see what the Japanese do next, because we know through that film and through the notes that we took that the Japanese wanted to modernize. Well, they modernized so much that they really start to develop an identity as one of the most important empires out in the East, and that's going to lead them to do some pretty awful things in the name of imperialism. So today we're going to talk about Japanese imperialism. We do have one learning target that we're going to attempt to work with here today. The question just says, how and why did Japanese imperialism occur? So we're going to definitely be able to answer that here today. So first we better define imperialism. If you're unfamiliar with that word, it's definitely a very regular occurrence in world history, and it's actually a pretty easy idea to understand. Imperialism is a policy in which a strong nation seeks to dominate other countries politically, economically, or socially. I always like to say it's when one country takes over another country, and that's a very simplified version of the definition, but we've seen that time and time again in history. When one country moves into another territory and starts taking away resources, power, freedoms, things like that from other people, that's imperialism. So during and after the Meiji Restoration, Japan was looking to strengthen itself and compete with the West, often expanding into nearby territories. We know that the Meiji Restoration was all about trying to improve Japan, bringing in modern weapons, bringing in modern techniques, really abandoning the old ways, such as the samurai. And so when that happens, oftentimes you can become more powerful than your neighbors, and sometimes you treat them as such. So like European countries, many in the Japanese government turned expansion into a systematic goal for security, national pride, resources for industrialization, settlement of overpopulation, and markets for manufactured goods. Now we need to look at that, understand this is what they wanted to do. And I think national pride is probably the most detrimental in there, because national pride often leads people to do things to improve their own country, sometimes at the expense of other countries. It's not a problem having pride. I mean, we have American pride as long as we don't say, oh, we're going to take over the Canadians and show them how awesome America is. That's imperialism. That's not allowed. You see the other things they wanted to do. They wanted resources for industrialization. They wanted places to put their overpopulation. So they wanted to expand, and you know, a lot of that is for the good of their country, but it doesn't stop to necessarily ask the question, is this good for the other countries or territories around us? So this is a look at Japanese acquisition of land, or Japanese expansion. By the end of this, we're going to see Japan, which is right here. So this set of islands is going to end up taking over a lot of different property. Basically everything here in pink, in yellow, in purple, and this greenish color here will eventually, by the 1940s, be added to the Japanese Empire. And these countries weren't saying, come on in, Japan, we want you here. Japan went in and took it. That is imperialism. And that's how wars get started. There's no doubt this plays a huge role in World War II. So keep that in mind as we progress here today. Now, some of the reasons or explanations for expansion has everything to do with, you know, trying to help your people. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean you're asking the other people who you're taking from, but so let's take a look at what territories they went to first. So Korea, they wanted raw materials, farmland, and security. When they moved into China, same thing. They wanted raw materials. We wanted markets to sell goods to. There's also some farmland in China. Not a ton of farmland, but some. Hokkaido, which is an island which now is a part of the Japanese country. They wanted farmland, lumber, and other resources. Okinawa, another island, they wanted resources and security. So you can see just a variety of different reasons why you might expand into other territories. Now, expansion was also fueled by racism and social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is an idea that the survival of the fittest can be applied to human societies. The Japanese felt that they were the best, so they really felt like they were allowed to take land from other people because other countries were backwards or not well governed enough. And so they thought they were the top of the food chain and they could go in and take it. Certainly racism plays a role in that too, because if you don't highly value the culture of the people whom you're taking from, you're not going to bat an eye when you go, oh, we're going to take their land, we're going to take their food, we're going to take their livelihood, because you already devalue them to begin with, so you don't really feel like you're taking away from anybody who has human value. And that's a really awful idea as well. So you can see when you're taking stuff, when you're moving into territories, when you are imperialistic, it has some pretty negative things attached to it. Expansion into China caused conflict with both the Chinese and the expanding Russian Empire. This is going to lead to the Sino-Japanese War of the 1880s. When you hear the word Sino, that typically refers to China. So there's a war between China and Japan in the 1880s. This led to the end of Chinese influence over Korea. Naturally, with the Japanese and their modern weapons, their modern techniques, they're going to have the advantage over the Chinese, and they're going to win this war. So Japan's modernization and industrialization were key factors in their victory. The Chinese are still in a way playing catch up today. They're advancing pretty rapidly here in the modern world. But if you picture China in the 1880s, they would have been farmers. And the Japanese had modern military, like we saw in at the end of The Last Samurai, which would have taken place right around the 1880s. And they had much better weaponry. So naturally, the Japanese army is going to be tough to beat. So Japan was definitely becoming the dominant power in Asia. This also leads to a war between Russia and Japan, known as the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Now, I'm not going to bore you with details of that war, but it does show, again, the might of the Japanese, and Japan does win that war. So they win significant battles over their neighbors, China and Russia, in a period of about 20 years here, in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Little information here for you. At the end of the Russo-Japanese War, U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt helped negotiate the end of that war, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. And Russia had to abandon its expansionist goals in the East, allowing Japan to become the supreme power in East Asia. So if we've gathered anything from this point, Japan's imperialistic pursuits have made them tough to beat and pretty much number one in Asia. And if you know your American history, you know that's going to be problematic for the United States here quite shortly. So between 1928 and 1932, Japan faced a little bit of a domestic crisis. Economic collapse associated with the Great Depression provoked spiraling prices, unemployment, falling exports, and social unrest. Japan, like many countries during the Great Depression, suffered. It was not an American depression. It was a worldwide depression. Well, it was about this time in 1931 that the army independently invaded Manchuria, which is a region of northern China. This leads to a really, really awful story of imperialism. What we're starting to see develop here is slowly the idea of the greater East Asian prosperity sphere emerged. We like to think of the Japanese Empire as the Japanese Empire. They called it the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. What a name, right? Like that. Why do you need a name that long? But that was what the Japanese Empire was to the Japanese out in the East. So it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So here's another look at it. This is very similar to the map I already showed you. Everything in red here will eventually be controlled by the Japanese. I mean, there's no doubt by 1942, the Japanese Empire or the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere is number one in Asia. Nobody can stop them. Now, the really awful story that comes out of this is the rape of Nanking. While the Japanese army occupied parts of China, Japanese troops raped, murdered, and tortured Chinese civilians. This was part of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the Chinese city of Nanking, estimates say that Japanese murdered over 300,000 Chinese in roughly 6 weeks. I mean, that is huge. And these are not military personnel. These are men, women, and children, elderly. The Japanese moved in and just started slaughtering. It's one of those forgotten holocausts that probably should be talked about more in history. And because we don't focus as much on Eastern civilizations, you don't hear about this that much. And I think that's really, it's sad, and it's definitely a reflection of the Eurocentric historic mind that we often have. So this is a story that has to be told. Now, there is one story that comes out of this, and it's not known if this is true or not, but the most notorious atrocity of the rape of Nanking supposedly was a killing contest between 2 Japanese officers to see who could kill 100 Chinese first with only a sword. You can imagine what a brutal way to die that would be. These were people who were not the enemy. These were people who were not preventing the Japanese from achieving their goals. These were civilians who were slaughtered at the hands of the Japanese. Now, this is one of the most famous pictures from that time period, and it's gruesome. It's awful. And I want you to look at it very closely, because this is microseconds after this man's head has been cut off at the hands of a Japanese soldier. So that man there has been decapitated. It's only a fraction of a second away from his head falling and him falling over limp. I don't show that to you to shock you. I don't show that to you to gross you out. I show you that because it is a very vivid image of the atrocities committed here. A couple other images here, I think they speak for themselves. These are dead Chinese civilians. Very, very awful. And we're going to stop there. We're going to stop there and just sort of take a break. I want you to queue up part 2 when we're done here. Part 2 is going to lead us into World War II. So we've been talking all about Japanese imperialism, what they've done to other territories. There's no doubt World War II is going to really be the end of that, because we know from our American history, the Americans win the war and the Japanese lose. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about that in part 2, ending our section here on Japanese imperialism. So go ahead and hit stop and queue up part 2 and finish Japanese imperialism.